Get ready for war, as Age of Wonders 4 has a brand new expansion that's all about slashing and burning and endless bloody conflict. Empires and Ashes is bringing a bunch of new features to the table, and front and center is its new culture, the Reavers, imperial industrialists that will bring progress to the world by overwhelming force. But I don't just want to talk about the expansion alone. I want to look at the game as a whole and how it's shaping up 6 months since release. I slept on the game when it came out, as I'm sure many others did. Now, let's see if it's time we all wake up and play it. Let's get right down to basics. Age of Wonders 4 is a forex strategy game developed by Triumph Studios, published by Paradox. In case you're out of the loop, forex just stands for explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. I'll be using the term a lot, but you don't have to remember what it stands for. You'll rule an empire and see it to victory by developing it, advancing it, and destroying anyone who's slightly different to you. Age of Wonders has always filled a peculiar niche in the genre. It takes a high fantasy angle and adds in a healthy dose of role-playing. Your leader will travel the world and undertake quests. You'll hire and develop powerful heroes, and these characters can single-handedly turn the tide of a skirmish, battle, or a war. I played both Age of Wonders 3 and Planetfall a few years after they released, but ultimately they didn't have the depth and strategy to keep me hooked. I expected the fourth game to be the same, so I didn't play it on release. My plan was to wait for it to go on sale, play for a few dozen hours, and then just bench it, just as I'd done with the others. Yes, I know, I'm cheap and also fickle, a terrible combination. But now there's an expansion. There's a new race of bird people, the Krasura, and honestly this seems like a better time as any to live out my secret fantasy of ruling a band of bloodthirsty bird pirates. But they didn't have to be ruthless conquerors, they could be powerful mystics or stalwart crusaders, or just a band of bad bird bonemancers. See, Age of Wonders is a game all about choice. You aren't given a faction to just play, you can tailor it in any way you want. All these options were initially a bit dizzying, and I didn't have any idea what anything meant. So I put my dream of avian supremacy on hold and opted to play the tutorial scenario, picking the most boring faction I could think of: lawful good human knights. So, being a 4X game, you'd expect Age of Wonders 4 to not skimp on the mechanics and systems and intricacies. Running an empire is no simple matter after all. The tutorial did a good job of running me through the basics, and I settled in pretty quickly. Navigating the world and all my important emperor tools was simple enough, and I was carried by a frankly excellent UI. It's concise, informative, and just plain stylish. There's a ton of definitions and keywords that you're just not going to memorize straight away, but that's okay, because the game does something which I wish was the base standard for all strategy games: nested tooltips. Hovering over a keyword brings up a definition, which can lead you to another and another and another and another. I know most people won't find this as exciting as I do. I get it, I'm pretty lame, but this rocks. Your cities are the heart of your kingdom, and you'll increase their value by building structures and working the land around them. Tiles are split into little areas, and when you develop them, you have the choice of only 2 or 3 different improvements. What they provide is pretty intuitive. Food is for population growth, production speeds up building construction, draft trains your units, mana gives you magic for your spells, and knowledge helps you unlock new technologies. One thing the series does very differently from other genre heavy hitters is the game world. There's just so much going on. There are these important landmarks, wonders, which can be absorbed into your empire to provide a tasty bonus, if you can clear whatever nasties lurk within them. Your leader is the star of the show. They can level up, gain new skills, and be equipped with gear. They'll trigger events, and their decisions alter their moral alignment. Do bad things, then you become evil. Be nice, and good things happen to you. The tutorial was robust, but it felt like I was being held back. So, without much hesitation, I dropped the guise of being an honorable knight, murdered everybody in the game, and won a domination victory. With knowledge in hand, it was time to try the expansion content and make my feathery flock of pirate terrors. The game's built-in faction creation system is superb. There are loads of different races to choose from, and you can tweak each of them by changing their traits. You'll then pick a background which will shape your faction's playstyle and customize it to fine-tune your game plan. And finally, you do the most important part, make your people look cool. The game world in the expansion felt a lot more vibrant. I was on this lush tropical paradise teetering on an astral ocean. It looked great. The whole game does, to be frank. Everything is filled with so much personality, and I was really drawn into this makeshift fantasy world. The expansion introduces the Reaver culture as a playable background. Essentially, you're an empire-sized bully. Attacking opponents will give you a culture-specific resource, war spoils, which you can use to fuel your war machine and antagonize city-states. These free cities are a big part of the game. Independent settlements that you can curry favor with, and if they like you enough, they might pledge allegiance to you and become a vassal. From here, you can either absorb them into your empire or keep them as an independent province. Every now and then, they'll offer you an event or a quest. Some are quite nice, some a bit less so, like an ambitious son wanting you to kill their father. Bit grim, but hey-oh. The other new feature I decided to try out was the item forge. This is coming as a free update alongside Empires and Ashes. Basically, all those items you find that aren't much use to your hero, you can scrap them and use the parts to make something new. As you gather different resources around the map, you can imbue these items with different powers. Honestly, I didn't use this feature a whole lot, mostly because I just forgot it was there. It's a neat thing to have, and something that'll be good for min-maxing heroes once you know what you're doing, which I didn't. The story mode gives you a set of objectives to fulfill over the course of a game and feels more directed than a typical forex sandbox map. There's a splash of flavor in the world and objectives, and I think it's going to appeal to anyone who likes to see a story unfold. Personally, I'm drawn to the genre for the unpredictable nature of a random map. So after getting my feet wet in the story mode, I decided to have a tinker and set up my own tale. I went back to the faction creator once more. This time, I made a bunch of cannibal elf necromancers and fine-tuned their future stomping ground. Now I was off the rails, I decided to lean more into the roleplay of my faction and design them in the way that, well, that makes sense for a bunch of lanky folks who eat people. Age of Wonders 4 doesn't have a typical tech tree. Instead, you research spell tomes. Each of them has an affinity which affects your empire and provides passive bonuses, battle spells, enhancements, and some even introduce new gameplay mechanics. With the right tome, I could begin harvesting my enemy's souls and reanimating their fallen heroes to fight for me. How diabolical. The more you lean into a certain school of magic, the more powerful passive bonuses you can unlock on your empire development track, which is basically a skill tree for your entire faction. Some of these bonuses are a lot of fun and they really do change up your game plan. This is honestly just a great system, and as the game progresses you can get some really outlandish things. Though after dabbling in the sandbox mode, it became very clear to me that my band of hungry forest folk didn't really have a bright future ahead of them. Knowing what to expect, I restarted. But obviously I went back and made a new faction first because it's so much fun. This time, a fantasy trope, a barbaric orcish tribe. Yep, absolutely inspired by Warcraft. How original of me.
Something you're doing?
I wanted them to be master builders and intrepid settlers. I opted to try out the expansion's new victory condition, seals. Basically, these are points on the map that are guarded by powerful monsters, but if you control them, you start getting points. Get enough points, and you guessed it, you win the game. Every now and then, the seal would spit out more monsters and you'd have to defend against an increasingly scary threat. I figured this would be a nice point control thing to do on the side whilst I figured out which other victory condition to pursue. The game has a big combat focus, and I wanted my orc warband to rise to that. Age of Wonders does have a combat mode when you fancy a scrap, but usually I would just go to auto-resolve as these combat modes in 4X games typically feel a bit gimmicky to me. I did force myself to use it though. If combat goes badly when automatically resolved, you can try again manually, which is a nice way to do it. The first few fights felt clunky, and I was just sending in waves of units to all mash together in the middle. but as I got more accustomed to it, I started to realize that there is a knack to it. Your combat spells can harm and hinder opponents or buff your own units. Terrain can be used as a choke point, and well-positioned units can change everything. You can keep the enemy mob at a safe distance and engage at the perfect time. And you can't just pump out the same unit over and over as you would in most other forex games. You have to create a balance of units that complement each other as a well-rounded army. Everything sort of came together for my warband, and it was a really solid game. I started making decisions on the roleplay aspects and thinking, what would an orc do? I cast a spell that gave them dragon-like vitality and hardened their skin into a natural armor. And when total war broke out, I made some sort of pact with some sort of demon and gave all of my units wings and horrible features. I hadn't planned on it, but my orcs had accidentally turned out quite a bit like their Warcraft inspirations. It felt like a bizarre fantasy epic playing out, and I got really into it. I made friends, I made enemies, and when I inevitably got betrayed, it stung. Saying that though, the diplomacy aspect is an area I think the game needs work. Most leaders I met turned out to be pretty antagonistic, but there were a few that were programmed to try and keep the peace. Though that all just goes out the window when you're nearing victory, and everyone will turn on you and try to end you. On one hand, it did keep the endgame interesting. I wasn't just clicking end turn until I won. On the other, I don't know, it just felt out of character. Like 100 or so turns of pleasantries were rejected in a heartbeat. I hadn't even tried to eat anyone in this match. Ultimately, despite everyone trying to kill my strapping and boisterous orcs, they were victorious. I achieved victory using the seals, which Empires and Ashes introduces, and it was a lot trickier than I imagined. I really had to make it my main focus. Each seal was a hotbed of fighting, and it felt like a victory built around military strength without having to travel around the world raising cities. It's a good system, one that played out with way more complexities than I originally thought it would. I had my first victory under my belt, and that introduced me to another of the game's neat features, the Pantheon system. Basically, any victorious hero can ascend and potentially show up as a recruitable hero in future games. I don't see this as a selling point by any means, but it is a cool system. It gives me motivation to finish matches rather than just quitting when I know I'm going to win, something that I know every Civ player is guilty of. So with a few story missions in the bag and my first sandbox victory, I had built up a pretty strong opinion on this game. It definitely felt more focused than the past titles, and it had the depth I missed from the third game and Planetfall. The customization is also just way beyond anything I've come across in the genre. As for the expansion, Empires and Ashes doesn't introduce anything revolutionary, but that's not a bad thing. Usually in the genre, the vanilla game feels a bit stripped out, the expansion comes along and fills in those blanks and makes the whole thing feel richer and fuller. Age of Wonders, as it stands, already feels like a very fleshed out base game, so the expansions are just adding more events, more wonders, more cultures, more factions, more modifiers. It isn't overhauling anything, just giving you more tools to play with. That's not to say there aren't blind spots in the base game that could use some big changes. Diplomacy and trade just felt weak to me. I also usually love playing a seafaring nation in forex games, but that whole side of this just isn't good. Naval combat just feels goofy, and the perks to anything water-based feel tacked on as an afterthought. So yeah, there are areas that an expansion could fix, but that isn't what Empires and Ashes does. It's a big recommend from me overall. Now, granted, this isn't a game for everyone. If you like the genre, it's a no-brainer. But I think this could be an inviting avenue to newcomers to this type of game. I'd almost always recommend Civilization to them. I think it's great for beginners. But I don't know, I could definitely see myself recommending this instead to someone who enjoyed a good bit of fantasy. And given the current trajectory, we've more content packs and expansions to look forward to next year. At a bare minimum, they'll introduce tomes, races, events, units, and new gameplay mechanics. And these new features do add a lot of replayability. If Triumph and Paradox keep updating this with new content every few months, I'll be busy for a very long time to come. Though, most of that time is probably just going to be spent making weird races in the faction creator. Leave me a comment. Let me know your favorite fantasy group and where it's from, and I'll make them. I'll add them straight into my next game. And then I'll eat them with my elves.